Hi everyone, I'm really excited to be making a video with one of my old friends from high school on neurodiversity and mental health and ADHD and several other topics as well. So just to start with, Shayla, do you want to maybe start with kind of at what age did you first realize that you were different in some way or start to experience mental health challenges? And what was that experience like for you?
Sure, Sam. I I kind of think that hindsight is very 2020. There were a lot of things that I maybe didn't realize about myself when I was younger, and looking back now and knowing what I know about um, just the basics of autism and ADHD, different symptoms. Now I look back and think, oh yeah, those were definitely present when I was younger, and I just didn't really notice them. I would say that I for sure noticed that I had some depression symptoms and anxiety symptoms when I was a senior in high school. They were definitely present earlier. For example, I had a small piano competition that I was competing in at, I think it was like at the state fair, and I actually passed out. Just very briefly, I blacked out because I was so nervous. Um, and then in my senior year of high school, I started noticing that practicing music was really starting to get to me for an upcoming competition. And that was kind of a final breaking point where I needed to really start talking with someone. But looking back at my childhood, I was always the child that was super interested in a bunch of seemingly very nerdy topics. I loved learning about the US presidents. I loved learning about geography, and I memorized all the country capitals of the world and all of the presidents forwards and backwards. I would read books about them. My parents would have us go to like presidential libraries on, as part of our vacations. And so, there was definitely an interest early on in things that other kids might not have found terribly interesting. Um, I also know that I recognized that my mom was just trying to help, but she had said to me at one point in time, like, oh, Shayla, when you're talking with your friends, maybe try not to talk about yourself so much. And that was, now looking back, a realization of this is the way I relate to other people. It's not a mechanism of trying to monopolize a conversation. Um, but also I have to be really careful about interrupting people when I'm in conversation with them. That's more of a recognizing that now. And I tend to be very calculated in the way that I speak. So those are some things that I recognized in myself that ultimately were just kind of not really seen as neurodivergence at all in the community that we grew up in.
Yeah, thank you so much for that answer and introduction. And I very much appreciate your way of relating to others personally and the intense
Oh, thank
interest. I
you.
thought they were, really uh, valuable part of you. But the last part you mentioned kind of ties into my second question, which is how did the environment in which you grew up kind of shape your mental health? And sort of as a sub question of that, what do you wish would have been done differently?
Sure. So, as we've kind of discussed in the past, I think the community that we grew up in, just there was not much education around mental health, and there might have been even a little bit of disdain for uh, that kind of need. So, sure, there were Christian counselors, for example, that were available, but it seemed as if things were more surrounded by prayer and just, oh, it will get better if you read your scriptures and pray more, and realizing, especially in college, that doesn't work, especially for people who specifically have a hormonal imbalance or some sort of function processing issue that just cannot be fixed by simply praying or thinking good thoughts or reading scripture more. And so I realized that there just there was no education. I don't think like my parents, for example, I think both of them in some ways that I have interacted with them, I now understand that both of them are neurodivergent in certain ways. But, you know, I think then it was maybe seen as a difference in a quote unquote bad way or a strange way. Whereas now I see it much more of this is a benefit in the way that we see other people and our relationships with one another. And it can certainly be something that is more beneficial than harmful in our day-to-day interactions. And so in terms of what I wish could have been different, I just wish that our environment growing up could have been more educated, that there were actually more resources for people to understand what the science was behind neurodivergence and mental health disorders, and not to see it as my child is broken or something like that, but rather as, okay, this is just something about the way that my child is. And rather than see it as a burden or to see it as we have to make it better, to find ways of living that are ultimately more, I guess, creative. I think there are creative ways that we can live as neurodivergent people than just, oh, is it getting better? Going to therapy, is it going to get better?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one thing you said that kind of stuck with me is how sometimes in our hometown, it seemed like things were sometimes viewed through a lens of uh, neurodivergence or mental health challenges being potentially fixable by prayer or related to a lack of faith or something along those lines. And I guess I was wondering, as you left for college and potentially found other types of care or environments or supports, what was your experience with that? Like, kind of realizing that there are other types of supports out there. How have your interactions with the mental health care system been since then? And yeah, how would you describe your mental health now?
Sure. So for many of us, the mental health care system is a mixed bag. And I think that's very fair to say across the board. It can be very difficult to find good care. And sometimes, I mean, we're all human. Even trained psychiatrists and psychologists can make very human errors, even within their own extensive training. And so realizing that and trying to be, I guess, gentle and understanding, kind towards myself and also towards the people who are working in mental health and probably are most likely overworked. So when I went to undergrad, that was when I truly started seeking help. I knew I needed to be on medication. I needed to be talking to someone in therapy. And even though I, as a person with anxiety, was resistant at first to the idea of being on medication, because again, the idea, the lack of science in the community that we grew up in kind of gave the idea of, but you're going to become addicted to this. You're going to become addicted to this substance and it's going to ruin your life. Well, we don't say that to people who need heart medication or someone who needs to have a cast for a broken limb. And so there was definitely a sense of, oh, this is just like any other treatable illness. that people can experience, but it doesn't always have to be seen either as an illness. And so I had a really good therapist, thankfully, um, in undergrad, who unfortunately retired. And so I think it was like the last year and a half of undergrad, I had to kind of go back and forth. I was with a therapist that I'm not sure was quite as understanding. I've definitely been with some therapists who have said things to me that I've found to be rather uh, distasteful, or maybe well-meaning, but ultimately were kind of hurtful. Um, and so, from that perspective, I've had to kind of search for the right person that I think I can trust and that we work well together. And I still don't always know what that looks like. And I think the real uh, lesson for me of navigating the mental health care system is that as you continue to grow and evolve as a human being, it's okay to either stay with the same therapist for a long time if they're meeting your needs, or to switch if they aren't meeting your needs. And that's probably been one of the harder lessons for me to learn as someone who is a bit of a people pleaser and doesn't want to actually admit to a therapist like you aren't fulfilling the needs that I need to have met at this time. I don't necessarily think you're a bad therapist, but this just isn't quite gelling.
Yeah, I appreciate that answer a lot. And this is a little bit of a tangential question, and no pressure at all, but are there any kind of general indicators or things that you look for as kind of promising signs that a therapist might be a good fit, or maybe that it's time to transfer therapists, that maybe, as you said, that it was a positive relationship, but it's outgrown its course?
Absolutely. Speaking from personal experience, like I've had therapists who are very passive and just kind of let you talk for the entire session. Those are usually the ones that I try and steer clear of, or I'll indicate, okay, I don't think that this is a working relationship that is going to be fruitful. Um, Particularly because just talking with someone is nice, and oftentimes that is where I problem solve or where I'm able to express my emotions. That is something that I do frequently. But if I don't have any sort of feedback or even a little bit of pushback, I have found that if I am working with a therapist who gives me a bit of pushback, not in necessarily a mean or rude way, but a little bit of a tough love of this is what therapy is, and we need to work towards uh, coping mechanisms that are actually going to be useful for you in your everyday life so that you're not, a big ball of nerves every day. And so that's typically what I'm looking for when I'm looking at a therapist client relationship is, are they able to provide challenges to my thought processes, and then I can then start applying those challenges to my own thought processes when my brain basically is the little hamster running on a wheel and things start to spin out of control a little.
Yeah, thank you so much for that answer. So the next question is a little bit of a jump in topic, but I know in our previous conversation you mentioned that you were potentially looking into an ADHD diagnosis. So what has it been like to realize that you may have ADHD? Um, yeah, what is your experience like right now, kind of considering going in for a formal diagnosis? And sorry, I realize now this is like a multi-part question. I have a bit of a bad habit of that, but the third subpart is, why do you think your ADHD was overlooked and or undersupported by others growing up?
No problem. I'm happy to parse through multiple parts of a question. Um, So it's been a very strange journey. I'll be honest. I still didn't realize in a lot of ways that I was potentially someone who had ADHD, or maybe even slightly coexisting autism and ADHD for the longest time. And then I was talking with my husband one day, and we were discussing the symptoms of ADHD, and he said, I think that I would potentially have mild ADHD. And apparently, in that conversation, he also said, I think you might also have some of those symptoms as well. I do not remember that conversation. And so when he brought it up again, maybe a year and a half later, we were talking about, sometimes my husband will lose his train of thought and he'll stop mid-sentence, or other as such. And then he reminded me, yeah, I think you might have some of these symptoms. And I'm like, you thought this for a while? Why didn't you tell me? He said, oh, I did. I said, I don't remember that conversation at all. So that's kind of a little funny anecdote about me realizing, okay, so I lose things very easily. And I am now purposefully going through a process of, okay, here is where I put my keys at the end of the day. This is the chair that I put my purse on. This is where my backpack goes. And I'm not perfect about it, but that's one thing that I've had to do for myself. I've also always been a very emotional person. And while I wouldn't say that my emotional dysregulation is extremely disruptive to my life, it definitely means that I can cry almost instantly at something that bothers me. And to me, it's a little embarrassing, especially if I'm in public with someone that is maybe one of my mentors or a professor, and I do not want to cry in front of them, but it's just going to happen. And it's a very short emotional release. I usually cry just briefly and it's over. But I think a lot of this was overlooked, again, because there's just not a recognition of this is what children do versus this is what a neurodivergent child does. So while I didn't particularly have what people consider to be the most typical stimming symptoms, I did have things that I did, like I had problems with chewing my nails, or picking my nose, picking my face, picking at my scalp, what have you. And I wasn't necessarily a hyperactive child. I was able to sit in my chair just fine and pay attention in class. And I think there's this picture in people's minds of the hyperactive little boy who can't sit still and can't pay attention. And because we don't really pay attention to what little girls who have ADHD or who are autistic might look like, unless it's a more pronounced case, I think there's this societal expectation. Oh yeah, little girls, they follow the teacher usually. They don't usually seem to have an issue with hyperactivity unless it's really obvious. And there are these societal expectations of like, oh, don't do that. And so girls oftentimes will follow that thing of, oh, I'm just not supposed to do that. So you don't. Or you satisfy like nail chewing, what have you, outside of school because you know that you're going to get reprimanded for it. So I think that's the reason why it was overlooked primarily in me, and also why I didn't even realize, because I didn't have an education about what ADHD looks like. I generally knew, again, the most obvious autism symptoms, but again, it wasn't enough for me to realize that there are a good number of people that I spend time with every single day that have symptoms of autism, ADHD, either or, and that it's really a very normal thing, and it's not something to be afraid of. You know, as a lot of the media has portrayed, like, oh, you know, vaccinations have given my child autism. You know, like that. It's such a horrible thing. That's another topic for another day. But really, truly, that there are so many people that go undiagnosed, or even if it's just a very mild case, quote unquote, that people experience symptoms of ADHD, issues with executive function, etc., that there are ways to uh, creatively work within what ultimately makes that person comfortable and happy and what works for them without it being this is a problem. This is a problem we need to treat.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that answer. One thing you mentioned that I found especially interesting was sort of with emotional expression. That's an aspect of neurodivergence that I actually haven't seen talked about that much. You know, when I read about, for example, autism related trainings, or even when we do presentations on autism, there's often a lot of discussion about, like, here's how we make a sensory friendly classroom for, you know, university students. Here's how maybe we can adapt for literal communicators. Um, but I think that could be like a really interesting area to include in trainings on, you know, what if someone you're mentoring cries in front of you? How do you handle that sensitively, but potentially also like balancing that with not um, reacting so strongly that it might make the person feel put on the spot in some way. So that was a little bit of a tangent, but uh, yeah, I
No,
really
that's
appreciate your thoughts on that.
actually that's fantastic that you mentioned that. And I realized I didn't actually address part of the question, but I'll
Oh,
get back to that. Um, but yes, I've actually worked with multiple mentors that I have a lot of respect for,
mm,
but truly did not know how to handle students with anxiety, students with uh, panic attacks, students who would cry in front of them. And, you know, it's very normal. Uh, while I say that as a kind of a comfort in academia, it's kind of unfortunate as well, because then students are navigating a system that sometimes there's just a very distressing thing that happens, and you have to navigate your way through. And again, if I'm very upset, I will probably cry a lot, and that probably makes my professors even more uncomfortable. Oh, this person keeps crying. Like, now what do I do? But you know, there's kind of this I think individualism that we place on the person who is having the emotional episode. Oh, you need to get it together. Oh, you need to figure out how to navigate this, rather than it being a communicative situation where professors are given more tools of how to handle students that are either in major crisis or just are having a bad day.
yeah, and this kind of ties into the next question a little bit, which is, I realize I actually haven't introduced until this point, but you are a professional uh, musician and doctoral student, right? Studying music theory. Correct me if that's incorrect. Um, but how
That's
has
okay.
your love and background in music connected with your mental health? And have you found music to be kind of a positive outlet? I know you mentioned earlier that it could sometimes be a source of stress. Like, what is your relationship to music like? That's-
My relationship with music has been very multifaceted throughout the years. I I started playing piano when I was 4. I've always been in love with music, and it was quite obvious to everyone around me, like, oh, she's going to be a musician when she grows up. And I kind of knew that for myself uh, early on too. I did enjoy the piano competitions that I did with my piano teachers. Once my first piano teacher couldn't take me any further because she was teaching primarily elementary and beginner students, I switched to taking organ lessons and then again back into piano with a cousin of mine, and really, really enjoyed that process. And I think by probably my freshman year of high school, I knew that I was going to major in music. That was just kind of a given for me. But once I got to college, I I don't have anybody in my family, at least not in my immediate family. I have some members who are in the extended family that have gone to a 4-year college. My parents either were in trade school or did associate's degrees. And so I was navigating a system that was very new to me, not realizing that I was a very good candidate for graduate school at the time and not thinking about it. But I loved working hard. I loved my routine and my schedule. I was open to things uh, changing around whether, rehearsal schedules, etc. That was never an issue, but I started getting very burnt out because I was playing piano for a lot of vocalists and instrumentalists because there was a huge need for that at my undergrad. And we weren't being treated very fairly. Like oftentimes I would be underpaid, I wouldn't get paid at all, I would be asked to practice at all hours of the day and night. I didn't have good boundaries around that. And while I still enjoyed the process of collaboration, my senior year was when I finally started putting limits. And ultimately, my piano chops had dwindled just a little bit because I had stopped taking piano lessons with my professor solely because I was having back and neck issues. And I knew that given that I had professors who cared very deeply about me and were very good at helping my musical aspect, but were not able to address physical aspects. And frankly, I didn't really expect them to. They're not physicians, they're not physical therapists. I was going through, physical therapy, massage, rolfing, all kinds of different things to try and alleviate some of the pain. And ultimately, it took me until my doctorate to figure out how to manage things in a more healthy way. And I'm still working on it. But at that point, music was definitely becoming more of a stressor. And in my master's degrees, so I got 2 master's degrees, one in music theory and one in organ. I also had my moments that I was just absolutely on top of the world with being a musician. I got to travel, not a ton, but a fair bit with organ competitions and workshops. I got to go to Russia for the first time. Who knows, maybe the last one if things don't change, in 2017. And that kind of sparked some research interest for me. I got to go to Austria with an organ competition. I love traveling and getting to know people across cultures and language. So that was a big plus for me, being able to express myself as a musician, but also have these other aspects of my life that were important to me be fulfilled through that process. But once again, I was struggling with back and neck issues that my professors just didn't really know what to tell me. And it was in my doctorate that I finally managed to end up with a professor miraculously, because I started my doctorate during COVID, that understood a lot of body mechanics and was able to help me in the process of, you're a very tense person, actually. And the reason why you are tensing up so much is because you like to sight read. And sight reading makes you hyper focused, but it also makes your muscles tense. And so I still, with that professor, I loved working with him. I still enjoy working with him. He's my committee chair, and I'm in the process of, starting the end stages of the doctorate. But he also was someone that, I think maybe sometimes didn't quite know what to do with me. He had to remind me so often, you're practicing too fast, and you need to slow down. So I think there were moments of my perfectionism and my people pleasing that really started to get to me. Of, my professor doesn't think I'm a very good organist, I don't think I'm a very good organist, kind of thing. And so I thoroughly had to grapple with that. And I think it's more my inner sense of self, and my sense that my physical technique has maybe suffered because I've had physical injuries, um, that I've had to wrestle with as my stressors in terms of music, but also recognizing that I still love music because it's given me so much in terms of the way that I think about the world, all of the history that I've gotten to study. As I discussed earlier, big history buff, love culture and geography, etc. And I have learned a lot about the educational system, even though I'm not in music education, or a music education degree, I should say. That ultimately has made me want to be more compassionate and work towards a classroom where I can give things to my students in a way that maybe my professors didn't know how to.
Yeah, thank you very much for for sharing your experience with music and I guess the nuances of that. Um, the next question is also a little bit of a jump, but I was wondering what positives you've experienced, if any, if anything is you feel positive due to living with mental health challenges and or being neurodivergent. Like maybe either in either sense of the word, like experiences that were enjoyable to you that you feel being neurodivergent kind of enabled you to have, or aspects of yourself that are sort of intertwined with being neurodivergent that you really appreciate about yourself. Um,
Absolutely. Um, so the second year of my doctorate, my medication stopped working, and I had a very, very bad bout with mental health for a couple of months while the psychiatrist I was working with was trying to find something that would work for me. And we had to go through a lot of things that didn't work until we found something that did. And that was a particularly rough time for me. And I think while I'm talking about this very seemingly hugely negative experience, I just realized how incredibly strong I had become because I I didn't drop out. I had to play a recital that semester, and I did it, and I felt good about it. I did reschedule it for a slightly later time because I didn't quite feel ready, but my professor actually encourages that for students, just to make sure that they feel the most comfortable as their themselves as performers. And I was really happy with how I was able to manage that. And now I'm on medications that actually do work for me. And I think what's been so great about uh, this process is, interestingly enough, it's not just me, it's being in community about it. Um, and I have a lot to be grateful for. Certainly, my husband has been a big sounding board for me of discussing uh, thoughts that I've struggled with or behaviors that I've had to work through, my people pleasing, my perfectionism, kind of social diplomacy when I am terrified of dealing with a conflict. And he's really good with interpersonal communications, and I'm just really grateful that as someone who also is neurodivergent, my husband and I both, that we get to walk that journey together. I think it's extremely positive that we've had those experiences together. And also, I've just liked learning more about myself through the process of discovering what it means to be neurodivergent. Like, even if they're maybe a little embarrassing sometimes, like I'm talking my husband's ear off while he's sitting in the office with me, and then I realize, oh, Shayla, you're talking too much, and he needs to get back to work, and so do you. But discovering that about myself, or I often have to apologize for this, even though I'm hyper aware of it. Other people aren't necessarily, but I like this about myself. Whenever I go abroad and I'm speaking with someone who's for whom English is not their first language, there is something in my brain that causes me to adapt their accent as my own when I speak English with them. And I'm always terrified that they're going to think that I'm making fun of their accent or something like this. So I just explain to them, no, I am from the United States. I have an accent right now because this is something that my brain does. But I think the way that I've tried to understand it more is that I want the other person to be comfortable. And I'm hyper aware of, I guess, how would I put this? Because there are times that I'm not aware of the fact that I'm a loud talker, which seems to be beneficial for people who are maybe hearing impaired, but for some people it's maybe a little off-putting. But I appreciate the fact about myself that I want other people to be comfortable around me. And if I am automatically adapting my voice or the speed of my speech so that they can understand me better, I do see that as a benefit overall. And it's ultimately, along with my willingness to kind of talk to just about anyone when I'm abroad, it's really led to some lovely little friendships, even if they're just short-lived. You know, go out and get a drink in Amsterdam, you know, talk for a couple of hours about what it's like to grow up in Venezuela, for example, a person that I met on my most recent trip. So I appreciate that aspect of myself, and I think ultimately that being a neurodivergent person, not that I believe that anybody who is not neurodivergent doesn't have these qualities, but it's made me a more aware and a more caring person.
Thank you for your answer. Another point you mentioned earlier about it was like the sense of community. I think neurodivergent community can be a really wonderful thing.
Yeah.
And then the last question is a very broad one and very open-ended, but if you could make one change in the world, what would it be?
Yeah, I thought about this question a lot, and it's difficult to answer with just one thing. But I think what I would love to see change in the world is that people have a better understanding of what it's like to walk in another person's shoes, no matter what that looks like. Particularly for the mental health community, that people become more understanding, that we are able to have the resources to educate and to provide uh, therapy that is helpful and not harmful, but ultimately just that the general population uh, across the world, not just the United States, even though we definitely need it in the United States right now, um, is able to look across, I guess, look across the aisle is often what we talk about in terms of our politics, and understand that we're all human. We all have things that we struggle with. And something that was said just this week was just allowing ourselves to be curious in a good way. Be curious about the people that you're around, because you have no idea what anybody else is going through, or what their triumphs, what their dreams are. And so allowing yourself to uh, just just be compassionate.
Absolutely. I think compassion and curiosity could really change the world if we let it.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much again for your time and sharing your experience. I appreciate it immensely. Um, yeah.
Of course, Sam. Thank you so much for having me.